In this exercise, I'm going to demonstrate the graphics options here inside the print dialog box, which once again require a PostScript output device, which is why I've gone ahead and set my printer to Adobe PDF. Now I'll switch over to graphics. And for the most part, these are some very obscure options that you never need to mess with. But in the name of full coverage, I'll explain how they work. First of all, we've got flatness. And this goes way back to the beginning days of PostScript. The idea is this. When you spend all that time drawing a very smooth curve using the pen tool and your control handles and all that jazz, or you're drawing a very smooth arc using, say, the ellipse tool, as it just so happens, PostScript can't really render that curve in completely smooth detail. Instead, what it draws is this infinitely complicated polygon with these super attenuated edges. And the flatness value determines how many edges there are. So if you turn off automatic for a second and you decide to crank this guy up to speed, why then you will lose a lot of those edges. You'll end up with something that's more recognizable as a polygon, incidentally, but you'll also have theoretically a speedier print job, so it'll output more quickly. Typically these days, you want to crank that thing all the way down so you have a flatness value of 1, as you can see there. That's the information that's imparted to the PostScript RIP. And that gives you the least amount of flatness. So in other words, you have tons of polygons, so your curves look nice and smooth. And it takes the most time to render as well. That's generally the same thing you're going to get if you just leave the automatic checkbox turned on. So just to give you an idea, I wouldn't mess with that option, but that's how it works. Next, we have this fonts option. Now, contrary to what you might think, very few fonts, if any, are built into the PostScript RIP. Most of them are housed in the operating system. So what ends up happening is Illustrator has to decide which characters of information to share with the printer. So does it go ahead and download the complete font definitions? In our case, we've got Birch, Adobe Caslon, and News Gothic, as you may recall. And so if we chose complete, we'd be asking Illustrator to share every single character of those fonts along with the printer before the print job even starts. And that means even those ornamental characters and all those accented characters that are a part of Adobe Caslon. Or do you decide to share nothing in a way of fonts, which would be deadly? That would kill the job in most cases. Now, in our case, it wouldn't hurt anything because we don't have any real fonts. We went ahead and converted all the text to path outlines, so that wouldn't hurt this specific job, but normally it would be a terrible idea. Or do you just leave it set to subset, which tells Illustrator to download the definitions of those characters that you actually use? And of course, that's the best way to go 99.99% of the time. Next, we have this PostScript option. Are you going to be working with PostScript Level 2? That would be a pretty darn ancient output device. Or is it Language Level 3? Most likely it is. The data format is not something you need to worry about at all. It's strictly a bandwidth issue. And then we come down to here, compatible gradient and gradient mesh printing. And the idea is that gradients and gradient mesh fall outside of PostScript's capabilities. So Illustrator ends up rendering out tiny path fragments and then masking those fragments inside of a clipping path. Now, that can sometimes cause problems. Whenever I have issues with outputting from Illustrator, I swear it's never transparency, it's never things like drop shadows, it's never blend modes, it's never any of those things that you think would be a problem. It's regular old gradients. And I've had problems where the gradient will drop out when it's just a gradient, but when it has a drop shadow or some translucent element set against it, then it holds up. So sometimes the transparency can end up helping the problem. It's just crazy. But anyway, if you end up having problems with your gradients or your gradient meshes, and we'll be looking at both in much more detail in the advanced portion of this series, then you can turn on this checkbox, which will go ahead and rasterize the effects. That is, convert your gradients to pixels. But then you get this warning. It says, use this option only when you're having troubles printing gradients or gradient meshes. Good advice. See the documentation for more information, which I think is hilarious advice, because what documentation are they talking about? The printed documentation that came with your program? No, because that didn't happen. Near as I can tell, they're talking about this document right here. This is the help document that you can get from the help menu, which is the far right-hand menu in the menu bar. And this is a section about rasterizing gradients and meshes during printing. And notice it says, very important, the compatible gradient and gradient mesh printing option, the one we just turned on, can slow printing on printers that don't have problems with gradients. Good point. By the way, actually, that's very true. So only select this option if you experience printing problems. All right, well, why wasn't that? in the alert message? Why do we have to go digging through the documentation for one sentence of information? Anyway, let's go back to Illustrator and click OK. Thank you very much for that message. And then we would presumably leave that checkbox on if we wanted to. And notice now that the resolution at which your gradients are going to rasterize is 300 ppi. Now, that's awfully darn high, I have to tell you, and that is going to slow things down, and it's very possible you might want to lower that. However, you cannot modify the raster effects resolution from inside the print dialog box, which continues to be a thorn in my side. I wish you could. You have to go out of the print dialog box and choose Document Raster Effects Settings from the Effect menu, even though it is ultimately a print issue. So we'll visit this command before we're done with this chapter, but for now, that's how the various graphics options work. I'm going to go ahead and turn that checkbox off, by the way, and leave all the other settings the way they were by default. In the next exercise, we'll discuss color management, which is a group of options that you'll want to be aware of, whether you're using a PostScript printer or not.